Elliot had always hated mirrors. Something about them unsettled him, how they showed everything back to you, but never quite perfectly. As a child, he used to cover them with blankets before going to sleep, convinced that if he stared too long, something might stare back. Now, at 28, he had moved into a new apartment in a renovated Victorian building. It was cheap, spacious, and eerily quiet. But what really caught his attention was the massive antique mirror mounted in the hallway. It had been there for decades, its frame warped with age, its glass slightly fogged. The first night, Elliot swore he saw something move inside the mirror. Not a reflection, a shadow, deep within the glass, watching him. He laughed it off, blaming exhaustion, but then the strange occurrences began. The first night, at 3:12 a.m., Elliot awoke to a soft tapping. It was rhythmic, deliberate, tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the hallway, from the mirror. Heart pounding, he crept out of bed and peered around the corner. The mirror was still, the room was silent. He took a cautious step closer. His own reflection stared back, but something felt off. Then, his reflection blinked. Elliot hadn't. He stumbled back, eyes locked on the glass. His reflection was smiling. He ran back to his bedroom, slammed the door, and didn't sleep until the sun came up. The second night, Elliot refused to look into the mirror, but that didn't stop it. At 4:47 a.m., the tapping returned, but this time, it was inside his room. The small standing mirror by his closet rocked slightly, its glass shimmering in the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. Tap, tap, tap dot dot. He grabbed the mirror and threw it face down onto the floor, heart pounding. Silence. For a moment, he thought it was over. Then, a whisper. "Why are you hiding?" Elliot didn't sleep at all that night. The third night. By now, he knew he had made a mistake. The mirrors weren't just reflecting, they were watching. He draped sheets over every mirror in the apartment. Even his phone screen made him uneasy. But it didn't matter. At exactly 3 a.m., his bedroom grew freezing cold. His breath turned to mist. He didn't dare move. Then, the bedsheet lifted ever so slightly at the edge. Something crawled onto the mattress. His pulse pounded. He wanted to run, but fear pinned him down. Slowly, he turned his head. A hand, pale, bony, and wrong, emerged from underneath the bed. It grabbed his ankle. Elliot screamed, kicking wildly. The moment his foot made contact, the figure vanished. His room was silent again, but the mirror was uncovered. And inside it, he saw himself, but it wasn't him. His reflection grinned wider than should have been possible, whispering, "Let me out." The fourth night, the breaking point. Elliot had had enough. Armed with a hammer, he stood in front of the hallway mirror. His reflection stood perfectly still, smiling. "I know what you are," Elliot whispered. The reflection tilted its head. Then, in a voice that was his, but not his, it spoke. "You can't run." Elliot swung the hammer. The mirror shattered, glass raining onto the wooden floor. He gasped, heart racing, but the reflection remained whole, unbroken. And then, it stepped out. Elliot never had a chance to scream. The aftermath. The apartment remained vacant for months. Eventually, a new tenant moved in. The landlord mentioned a previous renter had moved out unexpectedly. But every now and then, late at night, the new tenant swore they heard tapping coming from the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. And inside the antique mirror, a figure stood watching, smiling. Daniel had never been superstitious. When he moved into his new apartment, he barely paid attention to the floor-length mirror attached to the bedroom wall. The landlord had mentioned it was an original fixture, part of the building's history, but Daniel didn't care. It was just a mirror, or so he thought. The first night, as he was unpacking, something strange happened. He bent down to open the box, and when he stood back up, his reflection was still bent over. Daniel froze. A blink later, the reflection caught up, mimicking his current stance. "Just tired," he muttered, shaking it off. But the feeling lingered. A week passed. The mirror remained in place, untouched, yet Daniel began to notice subtle differences. Things weren't adding up. Some mornings, his reflection blinked out of sync. His toothbrush sometimes moved to the wrong side of the sink overnight. He swore he could hear a faint whisper when walking past the glass. On one occasion, as he was brushing his teeth, his reflection kept staring at him even after he looked away. One night, he decided to test it. Standing in front of the mirror, he raised his right hand. His reflection did the same. Then, it winked. Daniel hadn't. He stepped back, heart pounding. That was impossible. Shaking, he covered the mirror with a sheet. At 3:33 a.m., Daniel awoke to the sound of something sliding across the floor. He turned on the bedside lamp. The sheet he had placed over the mirror was on the floor. The mirror was uncovered, and in the reflection, the room was not the same. The furniture was wrong, distorted as if melting. The bed was empty, his own body missing from it, and standing at the foot of his bed, in the reflection, was himself. Only it wasn't him. The figure had hollow eyes, lips stretched into an unnatural smile. Then, it moved, not in the mirror, behind him. Daniel spun around, nothing. Heart hammering, he turned back to the mirror. His reflection was normal again. He barely slept that night. Daniel decided to get rid of the mirror. He had to, but when he tried to pry it from the wall, it wouldn't budge. His landlord, when asked, simply said, "It's part of the building. It's not meant to be moved." That night, Daniel dreamed of mirrors stretching endlessly, each holding a version of himself. Some were screaming, some were begging. One whispered, "You let him out." Daniel woke in a sweat. The mirror was no longer attached to the wall. It was standing in the middle of the room, facing the bed. Daniel refused to sleep. Something was wrong. He tried to avoid looking into the mirror, but the more he resisted, the stronger the urge became. It was as if the mirror wanted him to look. As the clock hit 3:33 a.m., his bedroom light flickered. The air grew heavy. Then, tap, tap, tap. From inside the mirror, the reflection was gone. The glass, once a simple reflection, now revealed another room, a dark, cold replica of his own. The walls in the mirror were covered with words scratched into the surface, phrases he could barely make out. "Don't trust it. He's watching. It's not you." A whisper came from inside the mirror. "Switch." Daniel stumbled back as his reflection stepped out. His double smiled. "I've been waiting." Daniel turned to run, but the apartment felt different. The walls stretched. The door seemed farther away than before. The more he moved, the slower he became, like the air had thickened. His limbs felt heavy, like something was pulling him backward. He tried screaming, but no sound came out. His reflection reached out. Daniel fought, kicked, but his movements were lagging, as if he were being rewritten in real time. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was his reflection stepping fully into the real world and whispering, "Your turn." The next morning, Daniel's friends tried calling him. No answer. They found his apartment door unlocked. Inside, everything was normal, except the mirror. Instead of a reflection, it showed Daniel's room, empty, and if you listened closely, you could hear someone pounding from the inside, begging to be let out. A few days later, a new tenant moved in. One night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., he awoke to the sound of something sliding across the floor. The mirror was no longer attached to the wall. It was standing in the middle of the room, facing the bed. Michael had always loved antiques. The way old objects carried history fascinated him, as if each piece had a story to tell. So, when he stumbled upon an old Victorian mirror at an estate sale, he couldn't resist. It was tall, nearly 7 feet, framed in dark, twisted oak with intricate carvings of distorted faces. The glass was oddly cloudy, like looking through a window into a world that wasn't quite real. The seller, an elderly woman, had hesitated before letting him buy it. "Be careful with this one," she had said, her voice low. "Some things belong to the past. They should stay there." Michael dismissed it as superstition. He took the mirror home and placed it in his bedroom, against the wall opposite his bed. It was perfect, or so he thought. That night, Michael woke up feeling watched. The room was dark, but the mirror caught the faintest sliver of moonlight, reflecting the shape of his bed. The surface of the glass seemed to shimmer slightly, almost as if it were rippling like water. He turned over, trying to shake the feeling. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across glass. Michael sat up, heart pounding, his eyes adjusted to the dim light, focusing on the mirror. At first, everything seemed normal. Then, he noticed something. His reflection was delayed. He moved his hand slightly, and a second later, his reflection copied him. But it wasn't just the delay. The reflection's eyes weren't quite right. Too dark, too deep. A chill ran down his spine. Maybe he was just imagining it. Maybe he was still half asleep. Then his reflection smiled. Michael hadn't. He scrambled out of bed, flicking on the light. The reflection was normal again, mirroring his every move. "Just a trick of the mind," he whispered to himself. "I'm overthinking it." But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Over the next few nights, things got worse. The scratching noise became louder. Sometimes, he would wake up to find handprints on the glass, even though he hadn't touched it. Objects in his room moved on their own, only noticeable through their mirrored versions. The most disturbing part was that he would catch his reflection staring at him even when he wasn't looking directly at it. One night, he woke up and saw someone standing behind him in the mirror. A dark figure, tall, hollow-eyed, unmoving. Michael spun around, expecting to see someone in his room. Nothing. But when he looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, watching. His breath quickened. He grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't sleep, not after that. The next morning, when he lifted the blanket to check, the mirror's surface was covered in deep, jagged scratches, like someone had been trapped inside, clawing to get out. That night, he dreamt of a vast, endless hall filled with mirrors. Each one held a version of himself, some distorted, some screaming, some silently watching with empty black eyes. He felt an unseen force pulling him toward one of them, an overwhelming pressure as if something was trying to drag him in. He woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. He decided then the mirror had to go. Michael carried the mirror outside to the garbage, but as soon as he stepped away, he felt a force pulling him back toward it. It wasn't just a mirror, it was a doorway, and something was trying to come through. Before he could react, the mirror shattered. But instead of falling to the ground, the shards floated in the air, reflecting different images, none of them his own. The largest shard showed himself, but his reflection was grinning. Then, in a blink, the shards were gone. The mirror was whole again. But when Michael looked at his reflection, he realized something terrible. It wasn't looking back. His reflection turned away from him and walked deeper into the mirror. Michael screamed, and in the real world, the mirror stood there, empty, waiting for its next owner.